Chapter 24. After they had flown for a while, Gregor remembered that Ares hadn't rested for a long trip through the tunnel. "You want to find a place to take a nap?" he asked. "I can keep watch." But even as he spoke, he yawned. He hadn't had much sleep either. "I am strangely wakeful," said Ares. "Why do you not sleep while we fly? I will rouse you when I have need of you." "Okay, thanks." Gregor stretched out on Ares's back. The fur was damp and it smelled of rotten eggs, but Gregor's clothes were in no better condition. Beneath the fur was the warmth of Ares's body. He closed his eyes and let oblivion take over. Ares let him sleep about 6 hours before waking him. Wow. They camped in a niche high in the rocks of the cavern. The bat knocked out immediately after providing Gregor with a few raw fish. Gregor picked up one of the fish and ripped off a strip of skin with his teeth. Then he took a bite of the cold meat. Howard had always cleaned the fish with a knife, cutting neat pieces away from the bone. Gregor didn't have a knife or even a sword, and what did it matter anyway? Still hunched over his fish on the stone ledge, he felt like he was in a time warp. He'd become a Neanderthal man or something, tearing into raw flesh, just trying to get the life-sustaining calories into his body. That must have been a hard life. Of course, his own wasn't exactly a picnic. He thought longingly of rich, fatty foods, Mrs. Cormack's lasagna, loaded with cheese and sauce and noodles, chocolate cake with thick frosting, mashed potatoes and gravy. He ripped off a stubborn piece of fish with a grunt. It didn't take long, he thought, to erase hundreds of thousands of years of change if you were hungry. Gregor wiped his hands on his pants and leaned back against the stone. He found himself staring into his flashlight beam, drawn toward the one bit of light in the huge dark place. He was down to his last set of batteries. If they ran out, he'd be entirely dependent on Ares to get him out. Who was he kidding? He was already entirely dependent on the bat. In fact, it didn't really seem fair. Ares kept them alive about 90% of the time anyway. Gregor didn't feel like he'd really been holding up his end of the bond thing. "So stop staring at your flashlight and keep an eye out for trouble," he thought. Disgusted with himself, he swept the beam over the surrounding rocks. Nothing new. Still, he had to get better about being on watch. Howard had said there were tricks to keeping your mind alert. Gregor did his multiplication tables for a while. That seemed to help. Next, he tried to remember the capitals of all 50 states. But that only lasted for, 50 states. Finally, he found himself to calculate something that he was consciously ignoring: the number of days he'd been in the Underland. It was almost impossible to figure out. He'd been in Regalia less than 2 days before they'd set sail on the waterway. He was pretty sure of that. He thought someone had said the trip to the labyrinth was about 5 days, then another day or two until he met up with Ripred. 9 days, 10. His family must be a complete wreck. He would be coming home right around Christmas, without boots, forever. Gregor went back to his multiplication tables. When Ares woke up, there was more raw fish, and then they took off again. They followed the same pattern for a day or two. Ugh. Gregor sleeping while Ares flew, Ares sleeping while Gregor kept watch, until finally Gregor awoke to the words, "Overlander, we are here." They were not moving. Gregor sat up and rubbed his eyes. The light was brighter than any he'd encountered for days. He slid off Ares's back onto a polished stone floor and looked around. They were in the high hall. It was completely empty. Somewhere, not too far away, he could hear music playing. "Where is everybody?" asked Gregor. "I don't know. But if there's music, there must be some sort of gathering," replied Ares. "I believe it's coming from the throne room." They shuffled along a few corridors and came to the doorway of a huge room that Gregor had never seen before. The floor sloped down slightly like a movie theater and was filled with rows and rows of stone benches. The place was packed with bats and humans who were dressed a lot fancier than usual. Many people held objects wrapped in cloth and tied with ribbons. Presents, maybe? Everyone's attention was on a large stone throne at the far end of the room. Nerissa was sitting on the throne. They had cleaned her up for the occasion. Her unkempt hair had been worked into an elaborate braid and piled on top of her head. Her jewel-trimmed gown hung loosely off her bony shoulders. Vicus stood behind her. He was reciting some sort of speech as he lowered a large gold crown onto her head. It was hard to imagine either Nerissa or Vicus looking sadder than they did at this very moment. "What's going on?" whispered Gregor. "It's a coronation. They're crowning Nerissa queen," Ares said softly. Luxa had been right. If she died, Nerissa would be crowned and not Vicus and his family, at least not yet. So I guess Howard and those guys got back, said Gregor. How else would they know that Luxa was dead? So it would seem, said Ares. If Marith had survived, he would be down in the hospital, but Howard and Andromeda should be here. Gregor looked around the hall, but couldn't find them. Vicus finished speaking just as he settled the crown on Nerissa's head and released it. Her thin neck bent forward under the weight, and Gregor thought how ill-suited she was to be queen of this violent, warring place. Whether she was mentally unstable or actually could see in the future wasn't the issue. The girl was too weak to hold up her own head with a crown on it. The image of Luxa shoving back her gold band flashed before Gregor's eyes. Whether she wanted to be queen or not, there was no doubt in his mind she would have been better for the job. But she was gone now. Howard was right. They should have made Vicus king. Vicus would make a good leader. He was smart and diplomatic, and he did not seem like he would let power go to his head. As Nerissa braced her hands on the arms of the throne, she managed to raise her head. Her eyes caught Gregor's. Something registered on her face, and then she fainted dead away, tumbling to the floor. The crown hit the stone with a clank and then rolled off. There was a big commotion. A stretcher appeared almost immediately, and Nerissa was carried away. There was a lot of head shaking and murmuring in the crowd from the Underlanders who probably had been opposed to Nerissa being queen in the first place. Then somebody spotted Gregor and Ares. They'd been standing in the doorway unnoticed since everyone had been watching the crowning. Now hundreds of faces turned their way and began to shout questions. Gregor could see Vicus waving for him to come down. This wasn't really how he would have chosen to reveal the story about the Bane, but he had planned to tell Vicus alone and then head home, but that option was gone now. As Gregor and Ares made their way down the aisle to Vicus, the crowd parted and gradually grew silent. By the time they'd reached the throne, it was as if everyone was holding their breath. Greetings, Gregor the Overlander. Ares, we are happy to see you alive. What news do you bring us? Asked Vicus. Did you find the Bane? We found it, said Gregor. The Underlanders broke into chatter. Vicus motioned for them to be quiet. And did you drain its light? He asked. No, we took it to Ripred, Gregor said. There was a moment of disbelief, and then the crowd went crazy. He could see the faces, human and bat alike, twist into fury. Something hit him on the side of the head. His hand went up and came away bloody. A small, ornate crystal jar was down by his feet. It must have been meant as a present for the new queen. More objects began to rain down on him. An inkpot, a medallion, a goblet. The one thing they had in common was that they were all made of stone. Gregor realized that it didn't matter how beautifully the gifts were carved. You could call them works of art, but it didn't change the fact that he and Ares were being stoned to death. Ares tried to get between Gregor and the mob, but it was no use. It was pressing in, forcing the pair against the back wall. Voices cried out for their death. Gregor remembered Ripred's word, and you'll have to pay for that in regalia. The rat might have been a little more specific. Through the chaos, he heard a horn blowing, and then the crowd was falling back. A ring of guards formed a semicircle around them. They were escorted out of the room. You will follow, said a woman who seemed in charge, and Gregor did, happy to be getting away from the mob. They went down flight after flight of steps and eventually reached a quiet hallway deep under the palace. The woman held a stone door open for them, and Gregor sensed that this was odd. There were few doors of any kind in the palace. He and Ares went inside the torchlit room, and the door swung shut behind him. There was the sound of something sliding into place. Where are we? He asked Ares. Is this like a special room to keep us safe? It's to keep others safe from us, said Ares. This is the dungeon. We have been placed under arrest for high treason. What? Said Gregor. For what? For committing crimes against the state of Regalia, said Ares. Did you not hear the charge? Gregor hadn't heard anything but a bunch of people yelling. Oh, man, he pounded on the door with his fist. Let me out of here. I want to talk to Vicus. There was no response. He gave up pretty soon since it really hurt to hit the stone door. He turned back to Ares. So treason, huh? That's great. What happens if we're found guilty? We get banished or something? No, Overlander, said Ares. The punishment for treason is death.